lecture, a special treat tonight. And we do this in partnership with the Dylan Schneider Group and Hearst Media. As I'm talking, take this moment to turn off your cell phones. And I just want to remind everyone that this is a hybrid program. So there's several people on Zoom who will be watching this. What that means is when we get to Q&A, you have to speak into the mic or else they will not hear the question. All right. Elm Street Books is in the back corner over there. They are selling a copy of the book. You'll want to buy it after you hear this talk. And they will have copies. So if you are out there in Zoom in the virtual land, you can go to New Canaan tomorrow and pick up a copy of the book. We have some upcoming programs in the Civility that I think you're going to be interested in. On March 10th, Cyrus Friedman of, now I don't have my glasses, so this is really, have to hold it really far. Cyrus Friedman is to talk about business and leadership. In April, former Representative Christopher Shays is going to speak. In May, it's going to be Joanne Lubin. And then we're going to finish it off with Faye Vincent. If you are excited about baseball and listening to Faye Vincent, then you might be interested in our program next week when our own Bobby Valentine will be here. March 3rd, that's Thursday. But for tonight, Andrew Roberts is an award-winning investigative historian and had unprecedented access to royal archives. The result is the first biography of King George III in 50 years, and the definitive one up for our generation, offering a cradle-to-grave biography in one volume. Andrew Roberts is the best-selling author of Churchill, Walking with Destiny, Leadership in War, The Storm of War, A New History of the Second World War, Masters and Commanders, How Four Titans Won the War in the West, 1941 to 1945, Waterloo, Napoleon's Last Gamble, and Napoleon, a life winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Biography and a finalist for the Plutarch Award. He has won many other prizes, including the Wolfson History Prize and the British Army Military Book of the Year. He is the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, a Lehrman Institute Distinguished Fellow at the New York Historical Society, and a visiting professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. And join me in welcoming him.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited to address you this evening, and thank you very much indeed for those kind words. When I told my wife that I was going to be coming here to try to put the positive aspects of King George III to Americans, she said, well, if you manage to pull that off, you do realize that King Herod is going to get in touch, see whether or not you might help make him Parent of the Year. We know three things about George III, don't we? The first is that he was mad, that he had porphyria, this terrible mental illness. The second was that partly because he was mad, but also because he was extremely obstinate, Britain lost the American colonies. And thirdly, that he deserved to lose them because he was a tyrant. And we know that from the Declaration of Independence, of course, which calls him unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And also from Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical, Hamilton the Musical. Ladies and gentlemen, all three of those things are completely wrong. He did not have porphyria. This comes as the result of a mother and son medical team in the 1960s giving false symptoms to doctors who diagnosed porphyria. In fact, for reasons that I set out in the appendix of my book, that is completely wrong. What he genuinely suffered from was bipolar disorder affective type 1, a form of manic depression. And even that did not in any way affect the American Revolution, because the first major outbreak of this took place in 1788, 5 years after America had become independent. And neither was he a tyrant. It's perfectly understandable why the founders should have tried to make him out to be a tyrants. They were quite understandably clothing themselves in the mantle of the great revolutions of the 17th century, the revolution against Charles I of 1642 and against James II of 1688. But he was not, George III was not an absolutist Stuart-style monarch. He actually believed in a limited monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. He revered the 1688 revolution and the settlements that threw up. Neither was he a monarch in the 18th century sense at all. Sorry, neither was he a tyrant in the 18th century sense at all. The tyrants were people like Catherine the Great of Russia, who killed 50,000 people after the Pugachev uprising, or what the French were doing in Corsica, what the Spanish did when they wiped out the entire leadership of the uprising in New Orleans, or the Prussians and the Austrians and what they were doing to the Poles at the time. By total contrast, George III never arrested an American editor, never closed an American newspaper, didn't try to stop the Stamp Act Congress or the First Continental Congress from meeting, and only ever stationed troops in one city in the 13 colonies, Boston in 1768. The Declaration of Independence, of course, is a sublime and Shakespearean declaration when it comes to the language. It's quite the most beautiful language. It makes you proud to be human, those opening sentences of it. The first third of it, as I say, is a profoundly important and moving document that has inspired people for liberty and democracy all over the world ever since it was written. However, the last 2/3 of it are a series of 28 ad hominem attacks on George III, only 2 of which hold any water at all. Mostly, they are a series of ex post facto rationalizations about the revolution. They contain attacks on George III for things that every king and queen had done in America since Elizabeth I. On some occasions, he actually is accused of things that hadn't happened at all. There's one clause about taking Americans across the oceans for trial. Not a single American was taken across any ocean for trial in the whole reign of George III. And so you have this essentially padding, lawyers' padding of the second 2/3 of the Declaration of Independence. And it is, but that doesn't matter, because the 2 clauses that do hold water, the 17th, which is about taxation, and the 22nd, which is about the power that Parliament's legislative power and veto rights over American legislation in and of themselves justify the American Revolution. The 1770s was the correct time, the right time for America to become independent. You had a population of 2.5 million people. You had burgeoning 7% year-on-year growth. You had as many bookshops in Philadelphia as in any other city of the empire apart from London. So it was the right time for America to be independent. But that doesn't mean that George III was a tyrant, which he wasn't. I was very fortunate in the course of the research for this book that Her Majesty the Queen in 2015 put no fewer than 200,000 pages of what's called the Georgian Papers program online. And 100,000 or so of those relate to George III, his papers, his letters, diary, memoranda, and so on. And in the course of that, there has been, and also, of course, working in the Royal Archives, this Georgian Papers programme is a collaboration, wonderful collaboration, between the Royal Archives and the King's College London, where I'm very proud to be a visiting professor. And what it has done is to throw enormous amounts of completely new light onto George III. And one thing that I found in these papers, and I'll go on to others, of course, during the course of my talk, was something he wrote when he was Prince of Wales in 1750 in a commentary on Montesquieu's Essays on the Laws. And he wrote this: What shall we say for a European traffic in black slaves? The very reasons urged for it will be perhaps sufficient to make us hold such practice in execration. For an inhuman custom, wantonly practiced by the most enlightened, polite nations in the world, there is no occasion to answer them, for they stand self-condemned. George III never bought or sold a slave in his life. He never invested in any of the companies that did that. He signed the legislation in 1807 that abolished the slave trade. And yet he's always, for the last 200 years, been held as being on a morally lower plane than the signatories of the Declaration of Independence, 42 out of 56 of whom owned slaves. He's also been attacked in the Common Sense, the great best-selling pamphlet Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, for being the royal brute of Britain. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man who set up the Royal Academy. The organization still exists today, designed to increase the status of artists in society, which puts on the great exhibitions in Britain. He owned a library of 80,000 books, which he bought from his own pocket rather than the taxpayers, but he allowed people off the street, anybody, any scholar, to come in, people like Joseph Priestley and Dr. Johnson, to come in and use his books. He had the planet Uranus originally named after him. He didn't ask William Herschel to do this. William Herschel came up with the idea of naming it after him. George's star it was in Latin originally, before its name changed, partly because he had helped finance the largest telescope in the world, through which Herschel discovered Uranus. He was in music, the person who invited Mozart to play at Buckingham House. He invited Haydn to stay in Britain. Handel said of him, "While that boy lives, my music needs no other champion." When it comes to scientific instruments, he built up the largest collection of scientific instruments in the world. The idea of this man being a brute is the exact opposite of the truth. In fact, he was a giant of the Enlightenment. He was somebody who, I haven't even mentioned architecture, of course, Georgian architecture, the great neoclassical architects such as Robert Adams and William Chambers and James Wyatt and so on. These people came to fruition in the architectural style that he very much supported. So I think it's important that we get rid of all the propaganda, the wartime propaganda critiques of George III and recognize him for who he really was. Born and educated in this country, he said in his first address to Parliament, "I glory in the name of Britain." He was the first British king for well over 200 years who had been born and educated in Britain, and was popular at the beginning because of that. He was also popular because he was interested in agriculture, which was the way in which some 80% of Britons took their livelihoods in those days. And although he was sneered at by intellectuals who called him Farmer George, actually people liked the fact that their king was interested in the progressive forms of agriculture, which helped them stave off hunger at that time. And he wrote articles in agricultural magazines about crop rotation and manure and things like that. Certainly the only English king who ever wrote about manure. So you have this rounded figure. He had a very unhappy childhood. When he was 12 years old, his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, died suddenly of an aneurysm, and his grandfather, George II, who hated Frederick, Prince of Wales. This is one of the things about the Hanoverian dynasty. They have this appalling family dysfunctionality where each of them loathed their children and were fully reciprocated in being loathed by their children. And this comes to a head when Frederick, Prince of Wales, dies, and George II refused to allow the corpse of his son to be buried at Westminster Abbey, and instead it was left to putrefy in the bedroom directly above the bedroom of the poor 12-year-old George Prince of Wales, until it was so decomposing that it was finally buried. George III was a good father, but he, like the rest of the Hanoverians, fell out with his son. This wasn't, however, his fault. It was owing to the fact that his son was somebody who, in the 3 years or so that I wrote this research and wrote this book, could find no redeeming features for whatsoever. He managed at one stage to build up debts that were the equivalent of the amount that Britain was spending on the Royal Navy in the Napoleonic Wars. A truly appalling figure. My book isn't in any sense a hagiography of George III. It's just really an attempt to rehabilitate him after 2 centuries of being denounced by Whig politicians and certainly Whig historians. I'm the first to admit that he could be appallingly self-righteous on occasion, and he had what I think was best described as a Hanoverian sense of humour. Which it was once said of the Hanoverians that they laughed at nothing so much as when you caught your finger in the door. It's reminiscent slightly of the old Mel Brooks line, "What's the opposite of comedy? Germany." And this was very much the case with George III. There are only 2 jokes that George III ever made, neither of which were funny. But luckily, the book has got lots of great gags in it, owing to the fact that the 18th century was the absolute height of parliamentary wit and repartee. I'm going to tell one joke, owing to the fact that I know that some of you have heard it before, but nonetheless, it was, it's my favourite joke of the late 18th century, when the Earl of Sandwich said of who was First Lord of the Admiralty in George III's time. I know this is a speech series about civility, but there's going to be absolutely no civility at all in the response of this remark of Lord Sandwich, who said of the radical journalist John Wilkes that he would either die of the pox or on the gallows. And Wilkes replied, "Well, that depends, your lordship, on whether or not I embrace your lordship's principles or your mistress." George III had tremendous courage, personal courage, both in the 6 assassination attempts that he faced. He was, on one occasion, he showed tremendous sang-froid. He was fired at, he was shot at in the opening of moments of an opera, and then he went to sleep at the interval. He was involved in the defense of Britain in both the 1779 and the 1803 to 1805 invasion attempts. He was extraordinarily good during the Gordon riots of June 1780, which caused more destruction than at any other time of British history in London. This was between the Great Fire of London and the Blitz of 1940. And during that time, his aide-de-camp said that the king didn't know what fear was. He had another thing that required tremendous courage from him was, of course, his malady. This terrible series of illnesses in 1788, 1801, 1804, and then finally between 1810 and his death in 1820, so the last 10 years of his life, which are tremendously pathos laden, because he by that stage had gone deaf and blind and had senile dementia, as well as his madness. And what the doctors did, who had no real advanced understanding of mental illness, was to straitjacket him, to put him on for hours and hours, sometimes days on end, to put him onto a chair which they nailed to the floor, and cup him, which was a horrible thing they used to do a lot in the 18th century, whereby you would have a glass cup put on your arm or your thigh and heated up in order to create artificial blistering. and they bled him, took large amounts of blood from him. Needless to say, ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the worst thing to do for somebody who's suffering from manic depression. And he had to put up with all of that. And then in 1804, when he had cataracts, the doctors put leeches on his eyeballs, which also, of course, required a tremendous amount of courage for him. One of the things about this book that makes it possible to write now in a way that one couldn't have necessarily 20 or 30 years ago is that we have, thank God, finally destigmatized mental illness in the Western world, and we're able to actually appreciate that if somebody goes mad like George III did, it's not his fault. It's not some moral failing of his, in the way that historians for at least 170 years took it for granted that it was. So in that case, I was very fortunate to be able to write this book when I have. George III is always blamed for having lost the American colonies, of course, but actually when it came to the strategy, the central grand strategy of that war, it certainly was not his fault. The plan was created by a man called Lord George Jermyn. This was, to all intents and purposes, the only major British strategic plan of the American War of Independence, which was to try to get an army from New York under Sir William Howe up the Hudson River at exactly the same time that Sir John Burgoyne was coming down from Canada. And they were going to meet at Albany, and thereby, through the control of the Hudson Valley, split the New England colonies off from the rest of the American colonies. And this was the central plan. And Sir William Howe instead veered off eastwards to capture Philadelphia, the capital, the colonist capital. And as a result, Sir John Burgoyne was captured at Saratoga in October 1777 with his entire army. And then what happened was that 4 months later, the French joined in on the American side. French are always there when they need you. And he was, and then you have, of course, as well as the French coming in 1778, the Spanish then declare war on Britain in 1790 and the Dutch in 1780. So what had started off as a colonial conflict, and not one that Britain was doing particularly well in any way. We only devoted somewhere between 45 and 50,000 troops at the absolute top of the largest number that were ever, and that was never at any one time. Nothing like enough troops to win a war of that size. But that colonial conflict was turned very quickly, therefore, into a world war, and one that had to be fought against France, Spain, and Holland, as well as the colonists everywhere, from out in the East Indies, in the West Indies, in the Channel. As I say, there was a serious attempt at invasion in 1779 in the Mediterranean, where the Spanish subjected Gibraltar to a grueling 1,000-day siege, and of course in America itself. So the war was lost, and of course also at the same time as having very few even half worthwhile generals, Cornwallis and Howe and Clinton. These people were going. They were not the greatest generals that Britain's ever put into a battlefield by any means, but they weren't chosen by George III. It wasn't his fault that we had such bad generals and such bad admirals as well. However, they were up against some of the greatest people in American history. Somehow you managed to fit into one decade people of the stamina and the charisma and personal strength of George Washington, the polymathic capacities, indeed genius, of Benjamin Franklin, the financial understanding of Alexander Hamilton, the wordsmithery of Thomas Jefferson, the political understanding of John Adams, men like Madison and Monroe and so on. This was an extraordinary constellation of capacity that you managed to bring together in one decade, at exactly the same time as George III was essentially trying to depend on people like Lord North and Lord George Germain, and Cornwallis and others. So entirely and completely outgunned. The defeat in 1783 led to a remarkable meeting between George III and John Adams in St. James's Palace, in the great audience, the first time that an American ambassador had an audience in Britain, and with the king in June 1785. And George III on that occasion said this: "I'll be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, and I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power," which I think is a particularly gracious stance to have taken. And then when George Washington gave up the presidency in 1797, he said that Washington was the greatest character of the age, which also, I think, shows a certain bigness of the king. He was unfortunate, really, that of the 14 prime ministers that he had, only 2 of them were any good, frankly. The first, William Pitt the Elder, was too infirm and gouty and ill to make any difference to the American Revolution, the conduct of it. And William Pitt the Younger didn't come on the scene until after the British defeat. Otherwise, he was, as I say, ill-served by politicians as well as generals. But he learned many of the lessons of the American War of Independence and put them into practice when it came to the Napoleonic Wars. And there we, the British, were an awful lot more fortunate. And when great admirals such as Admiral Nelson came forward, or the Duke of Wellington, they were supported and given peerages and given the money and troops necessary to win their individual conflicts. The legacy, it strikes me, of the king is really, I think now, the modern monarchy. I think much more than Queen Victoria, his granddaughter, it was George III who established the modern monarchy in the way that it works, because he was a constitutional monarch, and he never vetoed a bill or never tried to get rid of a prime minister who had the confidence of the majority of the House of Commons, except on one occasion in December 1783, when the radical Whigs were trying to nationalize the East India Company for their own benefit. And on that occasion, George brought in William Pitt the Younger, the 24-year-old, to become prime minister. And and in the subsequent general election, George III's decision was vindicated by a landslide victory for William Pitt the Younger. But as I say, it's the modern monarchy, essentially. He was the one who bought Buckingham House, present-day Buckingham Palace. He bought the Gold State Coach, which we're just having renovated at the moment for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee this year. He instituted the annual Trooping of the Colour. He was the first person to start the Royal Walkabout, the Royal Enclosure at Ascot. But more importantly, when one looks at Her Majesty the Queen today, one sees in her great ancestor the same frugality in eating and drinking, financial prudence, commitment to hard work, and sense of duty that George III personified. When I went to Washington to look at the Declaration of Independence recently, I saw that there had been a trigger warning attached to it. There's a little sort of plaque that says that that the views in this document are, I've got it down here, outdated, biased, and offensive. Ladies and gentlemen, anyone who doesn't realize that any document from the 18th century is going to be very different from the kind of document that one would read today has got to be only just this side of moronic. Frankly, I think people can understand that that every historical document needs to be seen in its context. But as far as George III is concerned, of course, I think that the remarks about him are indeed outdated, biased, and offensive. And now is the time to reconsider, if not even rehabilitate the man. What I do feel, and I know this is a big debate in America and has been for some time, is that in this great debate over American exceptionalism, there is something truly exceptional, because throughout history, nations have and peoples have grasped their independence, taken their sovereignty and self-government because of terrible oppression. One thinks of the Israelites escaping the Egyptians, the Dutch fighting against the Spanish, the Italians against the Austrians, the Greeks against the Turks. It's a well-known historical trope. But in America, what you did was to demand your independence and your sovereignty, self-government, from a nation that was not oppressing you and a king who was not a tyrant. Thank you very much. So, as you heard earlier, there are questions to be asked. I've got a, is this one of the ones that, there we go. Please put up your hand, and remember you're speaking to the ladies and gentlemen on Zoom as well as to us.
Thank you, Professor, for your comments tonight. Thanks to the library for having you. And you covered quality of British generalship during the American Revolution, which was going to be my topic. But if you could say a word about those Americans who remained loyal to the King and to Britain, and also just give us a plug about what you're working on next. Thank you.
Well, that's very kind of you. I'll start with a plug, if that's all right. I've just started to research a biography of Benjamin Disraeli, the great Victorian Prime Minister, which will take four years or so. So don't hold your breath for the next book. There's a gentleman in the audience here, Barry, who's brought 6 of my books that I started writing in 1999. So I'm afraid, Barry, you're going to have to, don't hold your breath. But with regard to the loyalists, they were somewhere around 30% of the American population. John Adams said that about 1/3 of people wanted the revolution, 1/3 were opposed to it and loyal to the king, and 1/3 were waiting to see which side was going to win and then jump onto that bandwagon. But what they were never capable of doing was to control any significant areas of territory, except perhaps down in the south in Georgia, for any long period of time. They were defeated, of course, at the Battle of King's Mountain, and they were not the very powerful force that they were thought to be. In fact, that was one of the areas that, when I mentioned that George III learned some lessons from the American War of Independence, one of those lessons was that you essentially don't trust the local insurgency, which was what in southwest France was the Vendée uprising. It was not going to overthrow Napoleon. And the British recognized that. They gave arms and money and so on, but they didn't change the strategy because of the assumption that the irredentists were going to win. And then, of course, what happened at the end with the loyalists is that huge numbers of them, well over 100,000, were either burnt out of their homes, you know, and forced to leave the nascent United States, or they had got to New York by then and they were taken out in the huge convoys up to Canada. And what they and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren did was to spread out all over the British Empire in Canada, of course, but some of them went to Africa, a lot went to India, some eventually went to Australia. And you see essentially American loyalists recreating the Second British Empire, which by the death of George III was the largest empire the world had ever seen. So it has a happy ending. So
you mentioned that George III was a constitutional monarch. And if you think of the evolution of constitutional monarchy, two questions. One is, what authority at that time did the monarch have? And then the second question, was he a passive element in the evolution towards constitutionalism, or was he active in promoting it?
Very good questions. Again, I think that it's important to remember there's a huge difference between the de jure and the de facto when it comes to royal power in the second half of the 18th century, in that the king theoretically had the right, even under the post 1688 revolution settlement, to declare war, to appoint all the judges whoever he wanted, to make peace treaties, to veto acts of parliament, even financial ones, and of course to appoint prime ministers. And so in that sense, he had Stuart level kind of powers. However, he also knew that he couldn't exercise them without at least the grudging support of the majority in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the support of the cabinet and so on. So, so the de jure powers and the de facto ones were very different. And to answer your second question, as the reign continued, and he was the longest reigning king of England, nearly 60 years he was on the throne. And of course, for the last 10 years, he was also mad. And so they had a regency where the Prince Regent took over. Because of that, and because, as I say, he very much revered the 1688 revolution, by the end of his reign, the powers, both de jure and de facto, in a sense, were less than they were when he came to power. What he didn't like, essentially, were the Whig oligarchs who had been in power for 80 plus years, and who he thought were overbearing and an aristocratic class that he didn't think had the God-given right to rule. And so he appointed Tories and independents and Scotsmen on occasion, and people who the Whigs up until that point had no time for. And you can see his reign as a way of trying to essentially undermine the Whig oligarchy whenever he was strong enough to do so. But he didn't ever. I think there were two pieces of legislation that he wanted passed, both of them to do with the royal family, the Royal Marriages Act and the Regency Act. And those were the ones, only two out of tens of thousands of acts of parliament that he himself wanted to pass. Madam, there's a lady here. Oh, sorry, there's a gentleman there, and then there's a lady in purple in the centre.
I was just wondering, you said he lived till 1820, and the last 10 years he was starting to go with the mental illness. But the War of 1812, was he involved at all in any of the decisions revolving that war?
None whatsoever. No, he had gone mad by 1810, but in the January of 1811, he had all powers taken from him. He lived at Windsor Castle, played the harpsichord, and nothing really is known of those last 10 years, apart from his doctors say what he was doing, but he had gone mad. So he can't be blamed for burning the White House, for example. Lady in the centre here.
And after this one, we have a couple of Zoom questions.
Great.
So it's been my understanding, don't know if this is correct, that George III wanted to continue the war, but that Parliament would not let him after Yorktown.
Yes, that's
Is it
right.
just-
He didn't see Yorktown in October 1781 as necessarily the end of the story. What he thought might have been possible, and the British, of course, had captured Charleston in 1780 and still held on to Rhode Island and to New York. And so what he thought was that if the British continued to fight on and to hold these places, once France and Spain and Holland had been knocked out of the war one by one, then Britain could concentrate on trying to either get as good a peace deal as possible out of the Americans, or maybe just hang on to New York and Charleston and Rhode Island in perpetuity. I mean, of course, we can see that today as being an absolutely insane concept that, you know, America, the American nation could start up without those three cities. But militarily, it was very difficult for America to take them, especially as we had a larger navy. There, to all intents and purposes, wasn't much of an American Revolutionary Navy that could threaten the Royal Navy, even in the early 1780s. And so, so yes, the king, when he said to John Adams in that quotation I gave, "I was the last to consent to the separation," that is literally true.
All right, the first question I have is many years ago, I'm going to butcher some names, I apologize. Many years ago, Peter Ustinov played King George III in a mock interview on American TV with Eric Savaride of CBS News. As I recall, the king said America would eventually become very much like England. Have you seen this? And do you agree?
No, I'm afraid I haven't seen this, but I do enjoy all those what ifs. There are several of them. In fact, the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, put forward one back in 1972, whereby George III actually visited America, because this is one of the very interesting things about him. Although he had this fantastic intellectual curiosity, I mentioned his books, and he also had a massive cartographical and typographical collection, 40,000 maps he had of the world, but especially the empire. He didn't actually feel any need to go anywhere. He was king of Scotland and Ireland, never went to either of them. He was elector of Hanover, never went there either. He never went north of Worcester in England or west of Plymouth. He actually basically spent his entire life in the home counties of England and London and Windsor, by and large. So what if he'd come to America and had actually even moved his center of government to New York? Because of course the Hanoverians had only been in Britain for half a century anyhow, since 1714. So you know, there are lots of very interesting what ifs. The other one, of course, was what if America had accepted representation? That great cry, no taxation without representation, one of the great battle cries of the world, actually doesn't take into account that to the Stamp Act Congress, the orders given by the North Carolinians and I think the Georgians were not to accept representation if it were offered. But what if there had been 100 American MPs in the House of Commons? Very difficult, of course, because you've got 3.5 months communication lag between these two entities. But nonetheless, one of the lovely things about history is that it is constantly bifurcating. There is nothing that is pre-arranged. You know, any number of possible things, outcomes can happen, because we're not determinists. Next question.
One.
Sorry. Can you talk more about how we know that the king didn't have porphyria? I grew up believing that.
Yes, everyone's grown up, but I grew up as well. But there are a series of things that people with porphyria have that the king didn't have, and a series of things that the king did have that people with manic depression, bipolar disorder do have. And if you could for the person on the Zoom call who would like to know more about that, it's summed up in a 6-page appendix at the end of my book, which I'm told is on sale now, in fact. So on that bombshell, I think we'll call it a day, and I'll go over to those nice ladies over there and try and sell you some books. Thank you very much indeed.
And he will be signing for anybody who would like to purchase. If you are on Zoom, you can buy a copy of the book at Elm Street Books in New Canaan.